Shalom Aleichem, Mishpachim. We are in a new Parshas Vaichi. All right, the book of Genesis, Breshis. This is the last portion of Breshis. And this is with Onkelos on the Torah, his translation. This Parsha of Vaichi is chapter 47, verse 28, through chapter 48, verse 9. All right, hold on. There we go. All right, so chapter 47, verse 28, which is right here, Parshas Vaichi. Onkelos' translation is on top, and further commentary on the bottom. All right. Verse 28. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. The years of Jacob's life were 147 years. Verse 28. Jacob lived. Although verse 28 begins the weekly Torah reading of Vaichi, the portion commences without the customary 9 spaces preceding it. According to Rashi, this symbolizes the trauma that followed Jacob's death. When Jacob died, the eyes and hearts of the nation of Israel were closed, just as the Torah portion is closed in, as a result of the effects of enslavement and the impact of its accompanying suffering. Suddenly, based on Genesis Rabbah, Rashi states that the closed portion suggests that Jacob wanted to inform his children when the end of Israel's exile would occur, but the prophecy was closed to him. Commenting on Rashi's first opinion, Chazkuni notes that while the serious enslavement did not actually occur until after the death of Joseph in chapter 50, verse 26, and Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, which was many years after Jacob's passing, yet the process leading to the enslavement commenced after Jacob's death. Chazkuni also explains that one reason, while verse 28 is not separated by 9 spaces from that preceding, it is because verse 28 is actually part of the prior narrative. 17 years. Joseph lived under Jacob's protection in Canaan for 17 years until his brother sold him, and Jacob lived under Joseph's protection in Egypt for 17 years until he died. 147 years. The Hebrew idiom is 7 years, plural, and 140 years, singular. While the Aramaic idiom, as in English, reverses the order and mentions years only once and in the plural after the number. Verse 29, Onkelos' translation. The days approached for Israel to die. He summoned his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor now in your eyes, place your hand now under my thigh, and grant me a good and truth. Do not bury me now in Egypt." All right. Verse 29, commentary. The days approached. This phrase is used in Scripture to suggest that the person lived a shorter life than his ancestors. He summoned his son Joseph. Why did Jacob summon Joseph and not his other sons? Chazkuni explains that God had told Jacob in chapter 46, verse 4, Joseph will place his hands upon your eyes, meaning Joseph would be the one to close Jacob's eyes upon death. Therefore, Jacob called Joseph to give him burial instructions. Rashi states that Jacob called Joseph because only Joseph had the capability and authority to fulfill his father's request. Under my thigh, the Sadi Gaon interprets the command as signifying with your hand toward the area of circumcision. In other words, just as today we raise a hand to indicate an oath, the ancient Israelites lowered it. This was an ancient practice akin to shaking hands after an agreement. See also commentary. Good and truth. The Hebrew phrase chesed ve'emet is an idiom. It literally means good or favor and truth. The word truth has no apparent relevance in the phrase, which is a typical characteristic of idioms. As such, the entire biblical phrase, do with me a good and truth, could be translated as do me a favor. Our Targumist usually treats chesed as good rather than favor. And ignoring Scripture's idiomatic usage, renders the second word literally as truth. Rashi also treats the phrase literally. The favor that one does concerning the dead is the true favor, since one cannot expect payment. Do not bury me now in Egypt. In addition to Jacob's desire to be buried with his ancestors, Rashi offers 3 additional reasons for Jacob's request. First being, Jacob foresaw that Egypt's earth would be turned into lice. And the second is that Jacob believed that unless buried in the Holy Land, his remains would have to be painfully carried through tunnels to the land of Israel at the time of resurrection. And third being, Jacob did not want the Egyptians to use his body as an object of idol worship. Verse 31, Onkelos' translation. Verse 30. When I lie down with my fathers, transport me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place. He said, I will do as you said. Verse 31, he said, affirm for me. So he affirmed for him. Then Israel bowed at the head of the bed. Verse 31, affirm. Onkelos sometimes uses the root shava for scriptures swear, and at other times the root kayam, meaning affirm, as here. Affirm implies that one is stating that he will carry out a deed, while swear indicates that he is certifying by an oath that his statement is true. Since it would be improper that God be required to swear, suggesting conviction that God would otherwise not fulfill his promise, the Targumist replaces the verb with affirm. Bowed. The object and intention of the verb is obscure. Commentators offer various possibilities. Jacob either bowed to Joseph or to God. He was either showing honor to Joseph, who was an Egyptian official, thanking Joseph for his promise, thanking God for Joseph's promise, or thanking God for restoring Joseph to him. At the head of the bed. Rashbam states simply that this is where Jacob was lying. The Saadia Gaon suggests that the phrase indicates the direction of Jacob's inclination, toward the end of the bed. Rashi, relying on a Midrash and on the Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 12b, explains that it implies that God's presence hovers, so to speak, over those who are ill. All right. Now here's Onkelos' highlights. We just finished chapter 47. And, all right. Our Targumist sometimes retains a biblical Hebrew word in his Targum, when it is better known to his audience than its Aramaic translation. An example is mezuzot in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 9, and chapter 11, verse 20. The Targumist also translates biblical words into languages other than Aramaic for the same reason. This occurs 6 times in Genesis. Greek words are used in chapter 6, verse 14, chapter 25, verse 25, chapter 41, verse 42, and chapter 45, verse 22. Persian words in chapter 25, verse 27, and chapter 43, verse 30. Beyond the text, commentators suggest that Pharaoh's inquiry reveals that he wanted to conscript Joseph's brothers into his service. Joseph anticipated Pharaoh's intention and selected, according to many commentators, his weakest brothers to appear before him. In Jewish history, Jews were required to be alert to the designs of those who reigned over them and to be exceedingly cautious in these relations. What role do Jewish political action groups play in the diaspora in safeguarding Jewish interests? Do such groups make other segments of the society feel uncomfortable? Is there justification for this feeling? It is interesting to note the question Pharaoh asked Jacob and his response. Why was Pharaoh interested in knowing Jacob's age? Assuming that Jacob looked old, what difference did it make to Pharaoh? Or is the Bible simply recording a human tendency for older people to inquire about the age of others just to compare how they look and feel to the way others appeared? Did Jacob add to his response that his years were few and bad to explain why he looked so old? If you summarize Jacob's life, would you come to the conclusion that his years were few and bad? Despite the tumult and difficulty of Jacob's life, shouldn't we have been grateful for the good years? Shouldn't he have been grateful for the good years? Let's review Joseph's strategy during the years of famine. He was responsible for acquiring all Egyptian land and wealth for Pharaoh and making the Egyptians into tenant farmers. Objectively, was that a moral thing to do? After all, it was the people's grain that Pharaoh had gathered to begin with. Why impoverish and enslave the Egyptians as a price for returning their grain? Yet the people seemed grateful and showed a willingness to become serfs. How do you account for this servile behavior? Wasn't there a danger of a backlash and a remonstration against the kinsmen of Joseph the Hebrew? Jacob exacts a promise from Joseph that he will bury him with his ancestors in the land of Canaan. Why was it necessary for Rashi to provide additional reasons for his request? Are those reasons convincing? All right. Verse 1, New Chapter 48, Onkelos' translation. After these things, it happened that someone said to Joseph, "Behold, your father is ill." He led his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. Verse 2, someone told to Jacob and said, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you." Israel strengthened himself and sat up in bed. Verse 1, the Hebrew is, he said, which Onkelos retains even though it is obscure, for the speaker is not identified. The Sadia Gaon alters the wording to the anonymous passive, it was said, but also fails to identify the speaker. Rashi, based on the Midrash Tanchuma, reveals that it was Joseph's son Ephraim who spoke. Radak and Rashbam agree that the passage is obscure. The speaker remains unidentified. Anonymous, individual. Rashi and Bechor Skor admit that there are many biblical verses that are truncated and obscure in this fashion. Led. The Bible has this as took. Here Onkelos has it as took. Here in verses 9 and 13, the Targumist substitutes the gentler, more courteous led for animate beings, while retaining the masterly, controlling took for inanimate objects. Verse 2, said. The Aramaic, as in verse 1, retains the biblical active verb he said, while the Sadia Gaon transforms it to the passive it was said. Strengthen himself. Why did Jacob strengthen himself? Rashi and Sforno visualize Jacob honoring Joseph since he was royalty. According to Chazkuni, Jacob had legal concerns. Jacob was demonstrating that he was sufficiently healthy to confer the gift of his blessing upon Joseph's children. For the gift of a healthy individual is irrevocable, while the gift of a sick, dying person can be revoked. Sat up. These words describe the strength that Jacob showed during the moments in which he gave his final charge. But when he finished, he relaxed, drew his feet onto the bed, and died. Verse 3, Onkelos' translation. Jacob said to Joseph, El Shaddai was revealed to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. He said to me, Behold, I will make you numerous and increase you. I will make you an assembly of tribes. I will give you this land to your children after you for an everlasting possession. Verse 3, commentary. El Shaddai in Luz. Jacob recalled his return from Padan, Aram, when God was revealed to him as El Shaddai. He reminded Joseph that God blessed him there and promised that he would give Canaan to him and his descendants. Now he was passing his rights to this land to his children and granting the firstborn double portion, mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17, to Joseph's two sons, since Joseph was the firstborn of Jacob's intended wife, Rachel. Verse 4, numerous. Onkelos has this as fruitful. Assembly of tribes. Onkelos reduces Scripture's nations to tribes, since the Israelites were divided into tribes, not nations. Children. The Aramaic usually uses children to explain the biblical poetic metaphor, seed, in simple prose. Verse 5, Onkelos' translation. Now your two sons were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you, to Egypt. Are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh are like Reuben and Simeon to me. Verse 6, your offspring that you will beget after them are yours. They will be called by the names of their brothers and their inheritance. Verse 6, will be called by the names. Future children born to Joseph would live in the land allocated to Manasseh and Ephraim. Rashi and Nachmanides differ on how the land was allocated. Rashi maintains that Canaan was apportioned by tribal population, whereby larger tribes received larger portions of land. Each tribal member received the same amount of land, except a firstborn, who was provided a double portion. Nachmanides insists that the land was divided into 12 equal parts, each tribe receiving the same quantity of land. Verse 7, Onkelos' translation. As for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died to me in the land of Canaan, on the way while there was still a distance of land to come, to Ephrat. I buried her there on the way to Ephrat, which is Bethlehem. Verse 8, Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, Who are these? Verse 7, As for me, why did Jacob mention Rachel at this time? Rashi supposes that Jacob was responding to Joseph's unstated question. Why should I transport your body such a great distance when you neglected to carry my mother the few miles to the double cave, the cave of Machpelah? Jacob excused himself by arguing that he acted to help his descendants, for when they would pass her grave in 586 BCE on their way to the Babylonian exile, Rachel would weep and seek mercy for them. Nachmanides has Jacob inform Joseph that at least Rachel was buried in the Holy Land, and explained that unless Joseph fulfills his promise, Jacob will be buried in Egypt. Besides, Jacob explains, Rachel died suddenly, and although it was not that far to Hebron, he could not find anyone to embalm her, nor could he abandon the children and flocks. Nachmanides adds that Jacob did not want to bury Rachel in Hebron, because the Torah later prohibited a man from marrying two sisters. He was embarrassed to have the two sisters buried in the same sepulchre. And since he married Leah first, she had preference to the burial place. Rashbam and Sforno offer other reasons for Jacob's not burying Rachel in Hebron. According to Rashbam, the distance was too great to bury her in Hebron. Sforno states that Jacob's grief was so intense that he lacked the strength to transport her. Distance of land. Onkelos has this Hebrew spelling, Kivrat Eretz. Rashi recognizes that the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew implies a distance of the amount of land one could plow in a single day, but feels that it is really smaller, the length of a single plowing. Verse 8, Israel saw Joseph's sons. Verse 10 states that Jacob could not see, but it is an overstatement, for it states here that he saw them. Rashbam, Ibn Kaspi, and Sforno explain that Jacob could see figures but not identify faces. Verse 9, Onkelos' translation. Joseph said to his father, They are my sons, whom the Lord has given me here. He said, Bring them now close to me, that I may bless them. Verse 9, commentary. Lord. This translation has it as Elohim. Here, Rashi accepted the Hebrew idiom baze with this. Literally, Joseph showed his father his marriage contract to certify that his children were born to a legitimate union. Onkelos, Radak, and Chazkuni understand it as an idiom for here, or in this place. Bring close. The Targum has transformed scriptures took. The Targum has transformed scriptures took to led in verse 1, but uses bring close here and in parallel with verse 10 because of the context. Now, biblical Hebrew is na. Onkelos generally translates na as now, while Rashi usually renders it please. And that is the conclusion of the first Aliyah. Conclusion of the first Aliyah. All right. Let's put the sefer away. I will read from the Daily Wisdom on the Parshiot. This is wisdom of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Vaichi, the first reading. All right, what I just read was Genesis chapter 47, verse 28 through chapter 48, verse 9. Parsha Vaichi, book of Parshas, Genesis. Jacob's final years spent in Egypt were the best in his life. When he sensed that he was about to die, he instructed Joseph not to bury him in Egypt, fearing that the Egyptians might turn his grave into an object of worship, since his blessing had ended the years of famine. In addition, Jacob told Joseph that God had instructed him to bury Joseph's mother, Rachel, in Bethlehem, rather than the family tomb in Hebron. For doing so enabled Rachel to play a pivotal role in the future redemption. The title of his daily wisdom on the Parshiot is called Trust and Questioning. When I was coming from Padan, Rachel died suddenly in Canaan, when we were still a stretch of land short of reaching Ephrat. I buried her there, along the road to Ephrat, which is Bethlehem. Jacob knew that his son Joseph trusted his judgment completely and accepted his decision to bury Rachel in Bethlehem rather than in Hebron. Nonetheless, Jacob was not at ease until he had explained his reasons for doing this to Joseph. The lesson here is that students are both allowed to encourage and to be bothered by their teacher's puzzling decisions. Along with trusting their teacher completely, they must seek to understand the teacher's ways and teachings. This is the necessary approach to Torah study in general. Although it is important to trust the wisdom of the Torah's teachings, we must also appreciate and understand the Torah's wisdom. And that is the daily wisdom on the Parshiot and the first Aliyah reading with Ankelos on the Torah, his translation. Have a wonderful day, Shavua Tov, and have a good new week. All right.